Hello, members of the board. My name is Annie Carter. Annie cleared her throat, looked down at the page she had crossed out and rewritten several times, and tried again. My greatest weakness is, are you practicing for an interview? The man's voice came unexpectedly from the table beside her. Annie turned toward him in surprise. The pen in her hand nearly slipped to the floor. I'm sorry. Was I speaking too loudly? The man lowered his newspaper and set his cup of black coffee back on its saucer. No, you weren't speaking loudly. Heat rushed into Annie's cheeks. She quickly looked around the Lantern Café, hoping no one else had heard her awkward answers. A woman near the window was looking down at her phone. An elderly couple at the counter were sharing a slice of toast. No one turned to look at her. I have a job interview this afternoon, Annie said quietly. I was just reviewing a few answers. I figured. He nodded toward the wrinkled folder in front of her. I've heard you muttering for the past few minutes. You keep starting the question about your greatest weakness, then stopping because you're afraid your answer will make you sound insecure. Annie hesitated. Did I really say that? More than once. She lowered her eyes. That's embarrassing. It doesn't have to be. But to Annie, it was more embarrassing than he could understand. The man at the next table looked to be around 50. The hair at his temples was beginning to turn gray. He wore a simple dark sweater that fit him well, and beside him sat a closed laptop and a cup of black coffee he had barely touched. Annie narrowed her eyes slightly. Do you have experience hiring people? A little. She looked at him cautiously. How much is a little? Enough to recognize an answer the person giving it doesn't believe. He tilted his head toward her folder. What position are you applying for? Annie placed one hand over the top page. She did not understand why a stranger wanted to know so much, but there was no mockery in his voice. It's a paid operations development program. Where? Westbridge Global. His expression did not change. They train people in logistics, warehouse systems, and business operations, Annie added. There are only a few openings. I passed the online assessment and 2 video interviews. This afternoon is the final round. He nodded. Why should they choose you? Annie answered immediately, relieved to finally hear one of the questions she had practiced all night. Because I'm hardworking, responsible, and always willing to learn. Those 3 things could appear on any applicant's resume. Her fingers tightened around the pen. But they're still true. I didn't say they weren't. Then what's wrong with the answer? It tells me what you want people to think about you. It doesn't tell me what you've actually done. Annie looked down at her notes. Isn't that what interviews are about? Telling people what they want to hear? Not good interviews. She studied him again. You speak as though you know exactly what happens in those rooms. I know enough to recognize when someone is trying so hard to sound qualified that she hides the very things proving she actually is. The remark unsettled Annie. The night before, she had sat on the edge of the folding bed in the small apartment she shared with her mother, searching for interview advice on her old phone until the battery died. She had copied phrases such as strategic thinking, professional development, and organizational alignment onto pieces of cardboard cut from cereal boxes, then practiced each one before sunrise. She had believed that using the right words might keep people from noticing everything missing from her resume. No college degree, no internship at a major company, no recommendation letter from someone with an impressive title. All she had were good grades. 2 years of work at a grocery store, a free spreadsheet certificate she had earned at night, and experiences other people often considered too ordinary to mention. Annie looked down at the glass of water in front of her. She had not ordered coffee because she did not want to spend the $3 she needed for bus fare that afternoon. I need this job, she said very softly. The faint amusement disappeared from the man's face. Then you need to stop giving them answers. They'll forget the moment you leave the room. Annie straightened the folder, as though making it neater might somehow make her feel less uncertain. My greatest weakness is that I demand perfection from myself. And sometimes that causes me to spend too much time on small details. However, I have learned to balance quality with efficiency. The man leaned back in his chair. That isn't your weakness. You don't know me. That's true, but you don't believe what you just said. Annie frowned. How do you know? Every time you say it, you lower your eyes. You rush through the first part, pause before the word however, and look relieved when you finish. Annie glanced at the phone propped beside the sugar jar. The dark screen reflected the lower half of her tired face. You notice a lot from the next table. Abit. What do you do? Today? I mean in general. I listen to people explain why they deserve to be trusted. That sounds like recruiting. Sometimes. His answer was too vague, and Annie understood that asking more questions would not make it any clearer. She turned the interview question sheet over. On the back were reminders she had written near dawn, in handwriting so small that only she could read it. Do not mention money. Do not mention mom's work schedule. Do not sound desperate. Do not use slang. Do not say how badly you need this job. She quickly placed her palm over the words. The man noticed, but he did not ask about them. What is your real weakness? He asked. Annie slowly exhaled. You want me to tell a stranger something I'm too afraid to say in front of the interview panel? A stranger can't reject your application. Annie looked at him. Then one of us can't. For the first time, he truly smiled. That was honest. It was a little rude. It was direct. Annie looked at the clock hanging above the pastry case. It read 9:18, though she knew it was 2 minutes slow. She had planned every part of her morning, 10 minutes for personal questions, 15 minutes for work examples, and another 10 minutes to rehearse the questions she would ask the panel. The stranger had disrupted the entire schedule. My real weakness, she said carefully, is that I don't ask for help soon enough. Why? Because I'm usually the youngest person in the room. If I ask too many questions, people might assume I'm not ready. And when you stay quiet, I make everything harder for myself. Give me an example. Annie frowned slightly. Are you interviewing me now? I only asked one question. That isn't an answer. Neither is perfectionism. The corner of Annie's mouth moved. She almost smiled. At the grocery store where I work, the handheld scanner stopped updating inventory during an evening shift. I should have reported it immediately, but I was afraid the manager would think I had used it incorrectly. So you said nothing? For 3 hours. What happened next? I checked everything manually. Then I discovered the scanner had counted the refrigerated deliveries twice. If I had asked for help sooner, we could have corrected it before the end-of-day report. What did you do after that? I created a paper backup form. Now, whenever the scanner loses its connection, employees record each delivery by hand until the system is working again. The man nodded. That is the answer. Annie looked down at the carefully polished sentence on the page. The words that had comforted her all morning suddenly seemed hollow. She picked up her pen, intending to rewrite them, but her elbow accidentally struck the edge of the folder. The papers she had stayed up nearly all night preparing slid off the table and scattered across the floor. Oh no. Annie quickly dropped to her knees, trying to gather the papers before someone accidentally stepped on them. One page had slid beneath the table beside her. Another had stopped near the leg of an elderly woman's chair. The woman bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to Annie with a gentle smile. Thank you, Annie said, her voice nearly drowned out by the sound of the coffee machine. The man at the next table moved his coffee cup aside and bent down to retrieve 2 pages lying near the toes of his shoes. Without reading them, he placed them face down on the table. You can just leave them there, Annie said quickly. I can pick them up myself. I already did. She took the pages from him, dipped her head in thanks, and tried to restore them to the correct order. Her resume went on top, followed by a recommendation letter from her school counselor and a 1-page report she had once prepared for the grocery store. One corner of the report was bent, and a faint blue streak ran along the margin, left behind when an old pen had leaked in her pocket. The man pointed toward the chair across from him. Sit down. You'll sort them faster that way. I'm Fina. You're kneeling on the floor organizing papers. Annie glanced toward the counter. Elena was serving another customer and did not appear to have noticed what had happened. Annie quickly stood, pressed the stack flat against the table, and returned to her seat. The man waited until she had safely placed everything back inside the folder. Do you always drop things when you're nervous? He asked. No. At that exact moment, the top page slid sideways. He looked at it. Annie quickly pulled it back into place. Not often, she corrected. The corner of his mouth moved, but he did not laugh. Annie looked at the clock on the wall. I need to keep practicing. Then practice. She looked down at the answer she had just revised, took a breath, and read it aloud. My greatest weakness is that I sometimes wait too long to ask for help because I don't want others to think I'm unprepared. I've learned that reporting a problem early helps protect the entire team. She stopped and looked up. The man said nothing. Well, better. Only better? It's honest. Now you need to make it more specific. I mentioned the scanner. You told me about it. The interview panel hasn't heard it. Annie picked up her pen and wrote a small note beside the answer. Use the scanner example. The man leaned back in his chair. Next question. Annie frowned. You're still going to continue? You said you need this job. That doesn't mean I agreed to have an entire interview with a stranger. True. But you haven't asked me to stop. Annie opened her mouth, then closed it again. The man irritated her. His direct questions made her feel as though every rehearsed answer was being stripped away, exposing the uncertainty underneath. Still, she could not deny that each answer became clearer after he challenged it. She turned to the next card. Why should Westbridge Global choose you for its operations development program? Annie inhaled. Because I'm hardworking, responsible, and always willing to learn. He raised one eyebrow. I know, Annie said immediately. Those three things could appear on anyone's resume. Good. Then remove them. But they matter. Then prove them without naming them. Annie looked at the empty space beneath the question. How? What did you do at the grocery store that no one asked you to do? She thought for a few seconds. I checked the delivery records before the evening shift. Why? Because the numbers were often wrong. How often? 2 or 3 times a week. And what happened when they were wrong? I compared the invoice with the items that had actually been delivered. Then I corrected the quantities before the closing manager submitted the report. Were you paid extra for doing that? No. Did anyone tell you to do it? No. Then don't tell them you're responsible. Tell them what you did. Annie lowered her head and began to write. I reviewed delivery records before the evening inventory count because inaccurate numbers affected ordering, storage, and product loss. I learned how to identify discrepancies before they carried over into the next shift. She read it aloud and looked at him. Does that sound better? It sounds more like you. Annie's pen stopped moving. No one had ever said that to her before. Her teachers had told her to make her answers sound polished. Online guides had told her to appear confident. Her career counselor had advised her not to mention anything too personal or too ordinary. No one had ever suggested that sounding like herself might be an advantage. She turned to another card. Tell us about a time you solved a problem. That one should be easy, he said. It isn't. You've already given me 2 examples, but they happened in a grocery store. So, this is Westbridge Global. They manage large warehouses, transportation systems, and contracts worth millions of dollars. A broken scanner in a small neighborhood store probably won't impress them. The man rested his forearms on the table. Operations are operations. A small mistake can cost $8 or $8 million. A sound process does not become less valuable simply because it was used in a smaller building. Annie studied him with renewed suspicion. You know a great deal about Westbridge. I read. It's more than that. He lifted his coffee cup. Ask me after your interview. That sounds like you're avoiding the question. I am. At least he admitted it. Annie opened the 1-page report inside her folder. The store manager once asked why the refrigerated section was losing so much inventory. Everyone assumed employees were leaving the food out too long. What did you think? I thought the deliveries were arriving at the wrong times. Why? Because the highest losses always occurred on Tuesdays and Fridays. Those were also the days when the store received its largest shipments. She placed the report between them but kept one hand resting on it. There wasn't enough room in the cold storage area when the trucks arrived. Employees had to leave some boxes outside while they cleared away the older stock. The temperature changed before the new products could be scanned into the system. What did you recommend? Delaying the large deliveries by 45 minutes and clearing space on the shelves before the trucks arrived. Did management listen? Not at first. What changed their minds? I tracked the amount of lost inventory for 4 weeks and compared it with the unloading times. How much did the store save? Annie looked down at the report as though the amount were too small to be proud of. A little over $800 a week. The man set his coffee cup on its saucer. For the first time since the conversation began, his calm expression changed. Why isn't that at the top of your resume? Because it was only experience from a grocery store. No, it was evidence. If Annie's courage and quiet determination touched your heart, please like this video, tell us where you are watching from in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. But it doesn't seem like the kind of evidence they want. Then perhaps the people reviewing the applications don't know what they should be looking for. His words did not sound like encouragement. They sounded like criticism directed at someone who was not in the cafe. Annie studied him more closely. You really have interviewed people before? Yes. For a company like Westbridge? He glanced at the clock. Your interview is this afternoon. You have time for 3 more questions before you need to leave. You still haven't answered me. I told you that you could ask after the interview. And how am I supposed to find you? The man reached toward the inside pocket of his jacket, then stopped. For a moment, Annie thought he was going to take out a business card. Instead, he withdrew his hand and folded both hands on the table. Let's see whether you still want to find me afterward. Annie did not understand the answer, but she wrote the amount the store had saved beside the problem-solving question. $800 a week. That number was far more convincing than hardworking, responsible, or willing to learn. Elena approached carrying a small plate with a blueberry muffin. I didn't order this, Annie said. Someone changed their mind after I warmed it up. Elena placed the plate beside Annie's glass of water and walked away before Annie could refuse it. Annie watched her return to the counter. No one changed their mind. The man looked at the muffin. Perhaps not. She does that sometimes. Why? So the person receiving it won't feel indebted to her. He nodded slowly. That is a skill most companies could never teach. Annie broke the muffin in half. She placed one half on a napkin and pushed it toward him. He looked at the piece of muffin. So you won't feel indebted to me, Annie said. He accepted it. All right, next question. Annie held up the final card. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? She looked at the answer she had prepared, remained silent for a moment, and then crossed out every word. In 5 years, I want to be someone people trust with problems that truly matter. The man waited. Annie looked down at her hands and added, and I want the person who hired me to know they made the right decision before I ever have to remind them why. This time he did not correct her answer. He simply reached for his coffee, realized it had gone cold, and smiled. The man watched Annie finish the last of the muffin before sliding the paper napkin toward the center of his table. You said you want to be trusted with problems that matter, he said. Let's see how you approach one. Annie glanced at the napkin. You carry interview exercises around with you? No, I carry problems around with me. That sounds exhausting. It is. He picked up her pen and drew 3 rectangles. Beneath them, he added a loading dock, 2 trucks, and a row of short lines that Annie assumed represented workers. A distribution center is missing delivery windows, he said. Overtime is rising. Managers say they need more staff, and the staff say the schedule is impossible. What would you do? Annie studied the drawing. Do I get any numbers? You can ask for them. How late are the deliveries? Between 20 minutes and 2 hours. Every day? Mostly Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Which trucks? The largest ones. Do they arrive late, or do they leave late? The man paused. They leave late. Then the delivery schedule might not be the first problem. What is? I don't know yet. He gave a small nod, as if that answer interested him. Annie leaned closer to the napkin. When does the company start measuring the delay? When the truck arrives. That doesn't make sense. Why not? Because the truck could arrive on time and still sit outside waiting for a dock. If the clock starts before the company is ready to unload, the report makes the driver look late even when the warehouse caused the delay. The man turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. What would you measure instead? Arrival time, dock availability, unloading start, unloading finish, and departure. Separately. Why separately? So you can see where the time is actually being lost. He added 5 marks beside the first truck. Annie continued. I'd also check whether the largest deliveries are scheduled after the storage areas have been cleared. What if management says the workers are too slow? I'd watch the process before agreeing. You wouldn't trust the report? I'd trust that the report contains numbers. I wouldn't assume it contains the answer. His eyes rested on her for a moment. That distinction takes some people years to learn. Annie sat back. Maybe they can afford to learn slowly. The words left her before she could soften them. The man did not seem offended. And you can't? No. She looked at the napkin again. If the store wastes $800 in 1 week, the manager still gets paid. I'm the one who gets sent home early when they cut hours. So I pay attention before someone decides the problem is people like me. People like you? Part-time workers. Young workers. The ones whose names are easiest to put beside a mistake. The man's fingers stopped moving around the cup. Annie regretted saying it. She had allowed the conversation to become too personal again. She pointed at the drawing. I'd also compare the schedule with staff assignments. If the largest trucks arrive during shift changes, half the team may be clocking out while the other half is still getting equipment. That happens. You said this was made up. I said it was a problem. She narrowed her eyes. A real problem? Real enough. From your company? He smiled faintly. You're asking better questions now. That's not an answer. No. Annie folded her arms. You keep correcting my answers, but you won't give a straight one yourself. That's fair. And I'm still not answering. She shook her head, though the tension in her shoulders had eased. You'd be difficult to work for. I've heard that before. That response made her examine him again. The coat, the watch partly visible beneath his sleeve, the laptop with no company sticker, the way he spoke about interviews and distribution systems, as though both were part of his daily life. You're not a recruiter, she said. No. A manager? Sometimes. What kind? The kind who gets blamed when other managers make expensive decisions. That sounds convenient. It rarely is. Annie looked at the time. She had planned to leave the cafe soon, but the stranger had shown her more about interviewing in less than an hour than the online guides had during the previous week. She turned the napkin over. Ask me another one. He leaned back. You're giving the orders now? I'm using my time. Good answer. That wasn't an interview answer. That's why it was good. He thought for a moment. Tell me about a time you disagreed with someone in charge. Annie's confidence slipped. That's a dangerous question. Why? Because if I say I never disagreed, I sound dishonest. If I say I did, I sound difficult. Only if you focus on the disagreement, instead of what you did with it. She tapped the pen against the table. At the store, the assistant manager wanted us to stop checking delivery temperatures because he said it slowed unloading. What did you say? I said removing the check would make unloading faster but increase waste. How did he respond? He told me I was paid to stock shelves, not question policy. The man's expression tightened. What did you do? I followed the instruction that night. You gave up? No, I kept the time records. For how long? 3 weeks. I compared the faster unloading times with the amount of damaged food. We saved 12 minutes per truck and lost almost $2,000 in refrigerated products. What happened when you showed him? He said the loss might have happened anyway. So what did you do next? I showed the store manager. Behind his back? I gave him the records first. I told him I was taking them to her. Were you afraid he'd cut your hours? Yes. But you did it. Yes. Why? Annie thought about the answer. Not the polished version. The real one. Because following an order doesn't make the result less wrong. The man went still. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and spread across the front windows. The brass bell above the door rang as 2 office workers entered, talking about a meeting neither wanted to attend. The man picked up his coffee and discovered there was almost none left. That, he said, is the answer you should give. To which question? More than one. Annie wrote the sentence at the bottom of her page. Following an order doesn't make the result less wrong. She read it twice. I don't want them to think I ignore authority. Then explain that you used evidence. Gave the manager a chance to respond and followed the proper path. You make everything sound simple. No, I remove the words people use to hide what happened. She looked up. Why are you helping me? He did not answer immediately. Because you were preparing to walk into an important room and introduce them to someone who didn't exist. Annie looked at the crossed-out phrases covering her notes. And now? Now they might meet you. The answer made her uncomfortable in a different way. She was used to advice that told her what to fix. She was not used to someone suggesting that the part she had been hiding might be useful. She began arranging her pages in order. The man glanced toward her folder. How much time do you have? Enough. That wasn't specific. My interview is at 2. I plan to leave here at 10. Review my notes at the library. Then take the train downtown. You plan the whole day. I plan most days. Because you like schedules? Because missing one bus can change everything after it. He nodded as though he understood more than she had said. Annie placed the napkin with the warehouse drawing inside her folder. You're keeping that? It's evidence that someone gave me useful advice before 10 in the morning. I thought you didn't trust strangers. I don't. But you trust the napkin? The napkin has data. He laughed softly. Before Annie could ask another question, her phone vibrated against the sugar container. The screen lit up, illuminating the name that had occupied her thoughts all morning. Westbridge Global Human Resources. Annie's back straightened. The man looked at the screen, then at her. Answer it, he said. She wiped her palm against the side of her skirt and picked up the phone. This is Annie Carter. This is Annie Carter. A woman answered in a measured voice. Miss Carter, this is Lauren from Westbridge Global Human Resources. I'm calling regarding your interview scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Annie straightened in her chair. Yes, ma'am. I have the confirmation email. There has been an update to your application status. The pause that followed was brief, but Annie felt it before the woman continued. Your interview has been canceled. Annie's fingers tightened around the phone. Canceled? I'm sorry for the late notice. There must be a mistake. I completed the assessment and both video interviews. Yesterday, I received instructions for the final round. I understand. Then why was it canceled? The woman took a breath. The applicant system completed an additional review this morning. Your score no longer meets the threshold for the final stage. Annie looked down at the papers in front of her. An hour earlier, those pages had felt inadequate. Now they seemed pointless. What changed in my score? I don't have access to the individual factors. Can I speak to someone who does? The decision came through the automated assessment process. We aren't able to reverse it at this level. Annie swallowed. I took the day off work. I understand. My mother changed her schedule so I could attend. I paid for transportation downtown. I've already passed 3 stages. I'm very sorry. The apology was gentle, but it did not answer anything. Annie lowered her voice. Did someone review my application this morning? I can only tell you what appears on my screen. And what does it say? Another pause. It says your professional readiness rating was adjusted. What does that mean? The system evaluates several indicators. Which indicators? I'm not authorized to discuss the model. The stranger at the next table had gone still. His coffee remained in his hand, but he was no longer drinking it. Annie turned slightly away from him. Could I still come in and speak with someone? She asked. Even for 10 minutes? I'm afraid security won't have your name on the final interview list. Annie closed her eyes. The woman continued. You may apply again when the program opens next year. Next year, Annie thought of the unpaid shift she had given up, the bus fare folded inside her wallet, and the blouse she had borrowed because she did not own one suitable for an office. She had spent nights teaching herself terms she disliked because she believed the right words might earn her a chair in the room. The chair had disappeared before she reached the building. Thank you for letting me know, she said. I'm sorry, Miss Carter. The call ended. Annie kept the phone beside her ear for another second before lowering it. She placed it on the table with care, as if one careless movement might break the control she had left. The man waited. Annie began collecting her cards. They canceled it? He asked. She nodded without looking up. Why? The system changed my score. What score? Professional readiness. He set his cup down. Did they explain what changed? No. Did a person review it? She wouldn't say. Annie pushed the napkin with the distribution center drawing into her folder. The pages resisted because she had placed them in the wrong order. She removed them and tried again. The man watched her hands. What company did you say this was? She let out a breath that almost became a laugh. You already know. Tell me again. Westbridge Global. His expression hardened. Annie noticed, but she was too tired to wonder why. Maybe the system is right, she said. What makes you say that? They built it to choose people for the program. That doesn't mean it chose correctly. It chose 6 people. I'm not one of them. A result is not proof of fairness. She pressed the folder closed. It doesn't matter whether it's fair. The interview is gone. The man leaned forward. Annie, what exactly did they tell you? That my score was adjusted this morning. That I no longer meet the threshold. That security won't have my name. And you passed every earlier stage? Yes. Did anything in your application change overnight? No. Then the question is not whether you suddenly became less qualified. The question is what they decided to measure. Annie looked at him. You sound angry. I am. Why? You don't even know me. I know enough. She shook her head and placed the pen inside the folder. You were kind to help me practice, but this is over. She stood and lifted the bag from the floor. The strap caught against the chair, and the folder nearly slipped again. She held it against her chest. The man rose. Wait. Annie turned. For what? He reached for the coat hanging behind him and put it on. Then he adjusted the collar as he removed his phone from the inside pocket. "What are you doing?" "Correcting something." Before Annie could ask another question, he selected a contact and raised the phone. The person answered quickly. "Margaret," he said. "It's Richard." Annie remained beside the table. The change in his voice was immediate. He no longer sounded like a curious stranger offering advice over coffee. He sounded like someone accustomed to decisions moving after he made them. "Yes, I'm aware there is a board meeting this morning," he continued. "That can wait." He listened for a few seconds. "No, I'm calling about an applicant. Annie Carter." Annie's grip tightened around the folder. The man looked directly at her as he spoke. "Her interview was canceled less than 5 minutes ago. Restore it." The voice on the other end was too faint for Annie to understand, but its pace quickened. Richard's expression did not change. "I did not ask what the system recommended. I asked you to restore the interview." Another pause. "No, not at 2 o'clock. Annie's heart dropped. She had known this could not be so simple. Then Richard said, "Move it to 11:30. He checked his watch. 44th floor, my office." Annie almost lost her grip on the bag. Richard listened again, then informed the panel. "If anyone wants to know why, tell them I want to hear how a candidate can pass every stage and become unqualified overnight." He ended the call. The cafe seemed quieter after he lowered the phone. Annie did not know what to say. Richard reached into his coat and removed a business card. He placed it on top of her folder. She read the name first. Richard Bennett. Beneath it were the words, "Founder and Chairman, Westbridge Global." Annie looked from the card to the man who had shared half a muffin with her. "You're Richard Bennett?" "Yes." "The Richard Bennett? I'm not aware of another one at Westbridge." She searched his face for some sign that this was a joke. There was none. "You own the company. I founded it. And you sat here letting me talk to you like that? You talked to me like a person at the next table. I told you that you avoided questions." "You were right." Annie looked at the card again. "They're going to think you forced them to interview me." "I did force them to interview you." "That's not better." "I didn't force them to hire you." She remained silent. Richard pointed to the wrinkled folder. "You wanted the chance to answer their questions. You have it." "Why?" "Because a system that cancels a qualified applicant without explanation deserves to be questioned. And if they decide I'm not qualified, then they should be able to explain why after meeting you." Annie's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Richard picked up his laptop. "Your interview is no longer this afternoon," he said. "It begins in less than 2 hours." She looked down at her borrowed blouse, the worn folder, and the glass of water beside the empty plate. "I'm not ready." "You were more ready 10 minutes ago than you were when you walked in. That was before I knew who you were. Knowing my name does not change your answers. It changes the room." "Yes," Richard said. "That is exactly the problem." He walked toward the glass door, then stopped beneath the brass bell. "Bring the answers you gave me," he said. "Leave the ones you copied here." A black car pulled up outside. Richard stepped through the door, and the bell sounded above him. Annie remained beside the table with his card in her hand. Elena approached and looked through the window at the waiting car. "You know that man?" she asked. "I thought I did for about an hour." "And now?" Annie slipped the card inside her folder. "Now I have an interview in the chairman's office." Elena smiled. "Then you'd better go." Annie did not move. "What if they think I'm only there because he felt sorry for me?" Elena's expression softened. "A person can open a door for you. That does not mean he walked the road that brought you to it." Annie looked toward the Westbridge Tower visible beyond the buildings downtown. Then she lifted her bag, thanked Elena, and stepped outside. She did not enter Richard's car. She walked toward the MARTA station with the wrinkled folder under her arm and the Billionaire's card pressed between the pages. By the time she reached Westbridge Global, her fear had not disappeared. It had simply learned to move beside her. At the security desk, Annie gave her name. The guard checked the screen and looked up. 44th floor, he said. Mr. Bennett's office. The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped inside and pressed the button. The elevator rose without a sound. Annie watched the numbers change above the doors and pressed the folder against her side to keep her hands still. On the 32nd floor, she considered stepping out and taking the next elevator down. By the 40th, there was no time left to retreat without making the decision obvious. The doors opened on 44. A woman seated behind a curved reception desk stood. "Miss Carter?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Claire, Mr. Bennett's assistant. They're ready for you." The word they tightened something in Annie's chest. Claire led her along a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs of warehouses, ports, and distribution centers. Annie recognized Richard in several of them, standing beside governors, executives, and workers in safety vests. In one photograph, he was shaking hands with a United States senator. In another, he stood beside a cargo aircraft with Westbridge painted across its side. The man from the coffee shop had disappeared into the person on the walls. Claire stopped outside a glass conference room. "May I take your bag? I'd rather keep it, please." Of course. Inside, 4 people sat along one side of a long table. Richard occupied the far end. He had changed nothing about his clothing. Yet the room seemed arranged around him. A woman with carefully styled blonde hair sat nearest the door. A red pen rested above Annie's printed resume. "Miss Carter," she said, "I'm Margaret Whitmore, Chief Human Resources Officer." Her handshake was firm and brief. "This is Daniel Price, Senior Vice President of Operations. Mr. Ellis is from Finance, and Miss Monroe represents Legal. You've already met Mr. Bennett." Annie glanced at Richard. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret noticed the answer but did not ask how they had met. Annie sat in the single chair facing the panel. The chair was lower than the others. She placed her bag near her feet and set the wrinkled folder on her lap. Margaret opened a file. "Before we begin, I want to clarify that this interview was restored at the chairman's request. Your automated assessment status remains under review." Richard spoke without raising his voice. "Her status is one reason we're meeting." Margaret's mouth tightened for less than a second. "Of course." She turned to Annie. "You understand that today's meeting does not guarantee placement in the program?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're comfortable proceeding?" Annie thought of Richard's business card, the canceled appointment, and Elena telling her that an open door was not the same as being carried through it. "Yes." Margaret uncapped the red pen. "Let's begin with a familiar question. What would you describe as your greatest weakness?" Annie almost smiled. She could still hear herself in the cafe saying the answer about perfection. For one moment, the polished sentence waited behind her teeth. Then she let it go. "I wait too long to ask for help," she said, "especially when I'm the youngest person working on something. I worry that questions will make people think I'm unprepared." Margaret wrote a short note. "That could be a serious weakness in a corporate environment. It can be serious anywhere. Can you give us an example?" "At the grocery store where I work, an inventory scanner stopped updating during an evening shift. I noticed the problem but didn't report it right away because I thought the manager would assume I had caused it. I spent 3 hours checking stock by hand before I found out the scanner had counted the same refrigerated deliveries twice." Daniel leaned forward. "What did you do after identifying the error?" "I reported it, corrected the closing count, and created a paper backup sheet for the department. Now the staff can record deliveries manually until the system reconnects." "Did management adopt it?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Margaret's pen moved again. "You're 18. Most of the people in this program will have college experience. Some have already held internships. How do you expect to work beside people with more education?" Annie took a breath before answering. "I expect to listen when they know something I don't. I also expect them to listen when I know something they don't." Mr. Ellis shifted in his chair. Daniel hid a brief smile. Margaret did not. "Would you say you have difficulty accepting authority?" "No, ma'am. You challenged a supervisor over the inventory process. I brought him evidence before I spoke to the store manager. That wasn't my question. No, I don't have difficulty accepting authority. I have difficulty pretending a wrong result becomes right because it came from someone with a higher title." Silence settled across the table. Annie felt the paperclip star through the fabric of her pocket. She had not planned to say the sentence. She did not know whether it had helped or ended the interview. Richard broke the silence. "What happened with the refrigerated inventory?" Annie turned slightly toward him. Margaret glanced at Richard. "That example isn't part of the standardized questions." "I'd like to hear it." Annie described the delivery schedule, the crowded cooler, and the boxes left outside while workers cleared space. She explained how she compared waste totals with delivery times and found that the largest losses happened on the same 2 days each week. "How much was being lost?" Daniel asked. "About $800 a week." Mr. Ellis stopped reviewing his copy of the resume. "800? Yes, sir." "And your solution?" "Move the largest deliveries 45 minutes later and clear cooler space before the trucks arrive." "How long did it take to show results?" 4 weeks to collect enough information. The losses dropped during the first full week after the schedule changed. Daniel looked at Margaret. Why isn't this in the assessment summary? Margaret checked the file. Her employment was categorized as entry-level retail. The system weighs it accordingly. Daniel looked back at Annie. Did you prepare the report yourself? Yes, sir. Do you have it? Annie opened the wrinkled folder and removed the single-page analysis. The paper carried a pale ink mark near one corner. She passed it across the table. Daniel read it first, then handed it to Mr. Ellis. Margaret waited until the page reached her. This isn't a formal business report. No, ma'am. It lacks standardized forecasting. Yes, ma'am. You don't appear concerned by that. I made it for a grocery store manager, not a finance department. It gave her the information she needed to make the decision. Richard rested one hand on the table. That sounds like understanding the audience. Margaret placed the report beside the resume. It also demonstrates limited exposure to formal reporting standards. Annie could not tell whether every strength would be translated into a reason against her. Margaret turned a page. Your application lists West End as your residence. How reliable is your transportation downtown? I use MARTA. Public transportation can be unpredictable. I take an earlier train when the timing matters. Have you ever been late to work? Twice in 2 years. Margaret marked something in red. And the cause? One train stopped because of a mechanical issue. The other delay happened during a storm. Would family responsibilities affect your attendance? Annie's hand tightened beneath the table. The question was broad enough to sound reasonable and personal enough to feel like a warning. I meet my work schedule, she said. That isn't quite what I asked. It's the part that affects the company. Daniel glanced toward Margaret, but she continued. This program involves long days and changing assignments. At your age, are you prepared for that level of professional commitment? Annie looked at the red marks gathering beside her name. I worked evening shifts while finishing high school. I studied after closing and still arrived the next morning on time. I understand long days. Margaret capped the pen. Hard work and professional readiness are not always the same. Richard spoke from the end of the table. How does the system define professional readiness? Margaret turned toward him. Through multiple factors, including communication, stability, education, and behavioral indicators. And which factor changed this morning? We can discuss that after the interview. I'm discussing it now. The temperature in the room seemed to fall. Margaret opened another folder. Before we examine the assessment, there is a second finalist scheduled for comparison. The door opened behind Annie. A young white man in a tailored navy suit entered with an easy smile and a leather portfolio. Sorry, he said. The car service took the wrong entrance. Margaret stood to greet him. Not a problem, Tyler. We haven't started your section yet. Annie looked at the wall clock. He was 12 minutes late. Margaret did not reach for the red pen. Tyler Grant took the empty chair beside Annie and placed his leather portfolio on the table. Thank you for waiting. Margaret smiled. We understand downtown traffic. Annie kept her eyes on the clock. Tyler had arrived 12 minutes late after using a private car. She had taken an earlier train because Margaret had already suggested public transportation made her unreliable. No one wrote anything in red. Margaret introduced Tyler to the panel, though everyone except Annie appeared to know him already. When Daniel shook his hand, Tyler mentioned a golf tournament they had both attended. Mr. Ellis asked about Tyler's father, who was apparently meeting him for dinner later that week. Margaret turned to him. Tyler, you spent a year traveling after college. What did that experience teach you? It gave me a broader view of how people work in different cultures, he said. I learned to adapt quickly and communicate with people whose expectations were different from mine. That kind of exposure can be valuable, Margaret replied. Annie looked at the red note beside her own address. Residential stability. Tyler had spent a year moving between countries. Margaret called it exposure. Annie took the same train to work every day, and her route had been questioned as a risk. Margaret continued, what excites you about Westbridge? The scale. I want to learn how a company this large makes decisions across different markets. And what kind of leader would you like to become? Someone who creates space for new ideas. The questions invited Tyler to imagine what he might become. Annie's questions had required her to defend what she already was. Richard remained quiet, but his attention moved between Margaret's notes and the scoring sheets in front of her. Daniel closed Annie's grocery report. I'd like to move to the operational exercise. Margaret nodded. Each candidate will receive the same scenario and 30 minutes to prepare a recommendation. An assistant entered with 2 folders and placed one in front of each candidate. You'll find shipment records, staffing schedules, overtime reports, and route data from a fictional distribution center, Daniel explained. The center has missed delivery windows for 6 weeks. Management believes employee performance is the primary cause. Tell us what should change. Tyler immediately opened his laptop. Annie reached for her pen. Margaret glanced at her. You may use the tablet provided. I'm faster on paper. Digital presentation is part of professional communication. Richard spoke from the end of the table. The instructions say candidates may choose their format. Margaret gave a brief nod. Of course. Annie opened the folder. The first page summarized the problem. Overtime had increased 18%. Employee productivity had fallen 9%. And late departures had doubled. The conclusion appeared at the bottom in bold. Insufficient workforce output during peak periods. Annie crossed out the sentence. She began with the shipment timestamps. The largest trucks arrived on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Those were also the days with the highest delays. She compared arrival time with unloading time. The trucks were not arriving late. They were waiting. Annie checked the loading bay schedule. 4 trucks were assigned to 3 bays during the same 40-minute period. 1 bay was regularly closed for equipment inspection, but the staffing report continued to count it as available. She wrote, not a worker speed problem, dock capacity problem. Across the table, Tyler built slides with headings such as performance accountability and workforce optimization. His work looked polished from a distance. Annie turned to the employee records. Several workers appeared twice in the same shift under different task codes. The system counted them as 2 people when calculating scheduled staffing, but only once when measuring output. That made the reports appear fully staffed when the floor was short by several workers. She raised her hand slightly. Mr. Price, does the system count a person assigned to loading and scanning as 1 employee or 2? Daniel looked toward the data sheet. It should count the person once. This report counts the task codes separately. Margaret leaned toward him. Candidates should work with the information provided rather than request additional interpretation. I'm not asking for interpretation, Annie said. I'm confirming whether the number is wrong. Daniel took the staffing sheet and studied it. After a few seconds, he said, she's right. Mr. Ellis reached for his copy. Margaret pressed her lips together. Continue with the exercise. Annie moved to the route data. Neighborhoods south and west of the city carried higher delivery risk ratings, even when the routes were shorter and had fewer recorded delays. She checked the zip codes against the actual travel times. The ratings did not match performance. She circled 6 rows. The final section measured employee inactivity. Workers received low scores when scanners went offline, even though the equipment logs showed repeated connection failures during the same periods. The system recorded waiting as idleness. Annie felt the same irritation she had felt at the grocery store when management blamed teenage clerks for spoiled food before checking the delivery schedule. The numbers had already chosen who to accuse. When the 30 minutes ended, Margaret asked Tyler to present first. He stood and connected his laptop to the screen. His proposal included stricter productivity goals, closer supervision, attendance incentives, and additional training for low-performing teams. The core issue appears to be accountability, he concluded. The center has enough staff, but output is inconsistent. Daniel asked, did you identify any limitations in the data? Tyler paused. No significant ones. Margaret thanked him and turned to Annie. You may begin. Annie remained seated. She placed 4 pages side by side. The center does not have enough usable loading capacity during peak periods, she said. The reports say it has 3 available bays, but 1 is regularly closed for inspection. 4 large trucks arrive during the same 40-minute window. She pointed to the timestamps. The drivers are on time. The warehouse makes them wait, then labels the departure late. Mr. Ellis leaned closer. Annie continued. The staffing count is also wrong. Employees assigned to 2 task codes are counted twice when the system estimates staffing, but only once when it measures output. The report says the center is fully staffed when it isn't. Margaret interrupted. The exercise asks for solutions, not a critique of the model. A solution based on a false count will fail. What would you recommend? Move 2 large deliveries outside the inspection window. count people instead of task codes, separate equipment downtime from employee inactivity, then measure the process again before disciplining anyone. Daniel nodded toward the route pages. What did you mark there? Annie held up the sheet. 6 neighborhoods have high-risk ratings that don't match their actual delays. What do they have in common? Richard asked. Annie hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it in the room felt different from seeing it on paper. They're mostly black neighborhoods, she said. Margaret's red pen stopped. That is an assumption, she replied. No, ma'am. It's a pattern. The shorter routes have higher risk scores than longer routes, with more late deliveries. You were asked to evaluate operational performance, not company policy. If the rating changes how deliveries are scheduled, then it affects operations. Margaret leaned back. You are making a serious conclusion from a limited exercise. I'm asking why the rating does not match the results. Richard looked at Margaret. Can the panel answer that? The scenario was prepared from internal training material, she said. Any resemblance to active systems is incidental. Daniel turned toward her. I approved the exercise. Those route scores came from the current platform. Silence filled the room. Annie looked at the pages in front of her. She had entered the building expecting to prove that she could understand Westbridge's system. Instead, she had found a system that did not understand its own numbers. Richard folded his hands on the table. Miss Whitmore, after the presentations, I want the source of those risk ratings. Margaret closed her folder. We should finish the candidate evaluation before expanding the discussion. We will, Richard said, and then we will discuss why the data blames workers for delays created by the company. Annie felt the paperclip star in her pocket. For the first time since entering the room, Margaret did not write anything beside her name. The panel dismissed Tyler first. Margaret thanked him for his time and told him someone from Human Resources would contact him by the end of the week. Tyler shook hands around the table, offered Annie a polite nod, then followed Claire into the hallway. The door closed behind him. Margaret gathered the assessment sheets. We should conclude Miss Carter's evaluation as well. Richard remained seated. Not yet. Margaret looked toward him. The scheduled interview period has already run over. Then move my next meeting. That meeting concerns the licensing contract. I'm aware. Margaret placed her red pen beside the folder. The candidate has completed the required portions. Richard turned to Annie. Would you wait in my office for a few minutes? Annie looked from him to Margaret. She could not tell whether she had passed, failed, or opened a question no one in the room wanted asked. Yes, sir. Claire led her through a connecting door into Richard's office. The room was large without being crowded. One wall held shelves of business awards and framed magazine covers. Another faced downtown Atlanta through windows that reached from floor to ceiling. Annie chose the chair nearest the door. On the low table sat a silver coffee service. She did not touch it. She placed her folder on her knees and listened to the muted voices beyond the wall. Margaret spoke first. Annie could not make out every word, but she heard phrases such as established procedure, applicant risk, and unnecessary exposure. Richard's reply was lower. Daniel spoke twice. Each time, Margaret answered quickly. Annie pressed her thumb against the paperclip star in her pocket. She had been asked to identify a problem. She had done that. Yet the more clearly she explained it, the more the room behaved as if clarity itself were dangerous. The connecting door opened 20 minutes later. Richard entered alone. He had left his coffee in the conference room. Without it, his hands seemed unsure where to rest. You did well, he said. Annie waited. He closed the door but did not return to his desk. Your analysis was stronger than the panel expected. Did the panel expect me to fail? No. Did Mrs. Whitmore? Richard considered the question. Margaret trusts the assessment system. That wasn't what I asked. No, he said. It wasn't. Annie looked toward the windows. From the 44th floor, the streets below seemed clean and simple. The buses followed straight lines. Cars moved through lights. No one could see delays, missed connections, or what one late train might cost a person who could not call a driver. Richard sat across from her. I want to offer you a 3-day paid work trial. Annie turned back. Was that already part of the program? Not in this form. So it's another exception. It would apply to every finalist. Because of me? Because today showed that the interview process may not be measuring what we think it measures. Annie held his gaze. If you hadn't been in that coffee shop, would I be sitting here? Richard did not answer immediately. No, he said at last. The honesty unsettled her more than an excuse might have. She looked down at the worn edge of her folder. Then I'm not proof your system works. I didn't say you were. I'm proof you made one phone call. Richard leaned back. That phone call restored an interview. It did not produce the answers you gave, but everyone in that room knew you made it. Yes, Margaret knew. The receptionist knew. Security knew. They treated me differently because I had your card. I noticed. I didn't change between the cafe and the lobby. No, only the name beside mine changed. Richard folded his hands. What are you asking me to do? Annie had not expected the question to be so direct. She looked at the printed resume Margaret had marked. Then at the napkin, drawing still tucked inside her folder. I want to know why the system canceled me. Margaret said your professional readiness score changed. That isn't an explanation. The model uses several variables. Which ones? Education, communication, work history, behavioral responses. And my address? Richard's expression shifted. Margaret asked about where I live before she asked what I could do, Annie said. She wrote something every time I mentioned transportation or family. Tyler showed up late because a car took the wrong entrance, and no one asked whether he was reliable. Richard glanced toward the conference room door. Annie continued before she lost her nerve. His year of travel made him adaptable. Taking Marta made me a risk. He was asked what kind of leader he wanted to become. I was asked whether I could act like an adult. You're right about the difference in questioning. Then why did you let it continue? The question remained between them. Richard looked toward the city. Because I wanted it documented. You could have stopped it. I could have, but you didn't. No. Annie felt anger rise, not loud or wild, but steady. People with power always say they needed more evidence. The person being judged has to sit there while you collect it. Richard accepted that without defending himself. After a moment, he said, the work trial will give us access to the operational system and the scoring standards used for every candidate. Same assignment, same hours, same pay, same evaluation. Will I be allowed to see what changed my score? You'll be allowed to review the criteria applied during the trial. Applicant information remains confidential. I'm not asking to see Tyler's personal information. I know. I'm asking what your company decided about me before anyone met me. Richard nodded slowly. I can authorize a review of your own assessment. Can Margaret change it again? Not without creating a record. That doesn't mean she won't. No, he said. It means there will be evidence if she does. Annie studied him. You talk about evidence like it fixes everything. It doesn't. But it gives the truth somewhere to stand. She thought about the grocery store, the spoiled food, and the supervisor who insisted workers were careless until she placed 4 weeks of numbers in front of him. What happens if the system is wrong, she asked. We correct it. For me? For the process. That's not the same promise. It's the one I can make before we know the full scope. Annie stood and moved toward the window. Far below, a MARTA bus stopped at the corner. People stepped off while others waited to board. My mother told me not to come here to be rescued, she said. She was right. I don't want a position because the chairman feels responsible for what happened. I'm not offering you a position. You're offering me another chance. I'm offering the same test to everyone who reached the final stage. Annie turned. And if I lose, then the result should be based on the work. And if I win, the same. She searched his face for the sympathy she feared. She found concern, but also something less comfortable. Responsibility. When does the trial start? Tomorrow morning, 6:30. Westbridge Distribution Center 7, outside the city. That's before the first direct train. A company shuttle leaves 5 Point Station at 5:45. I'll be there. Richard stood. You don't need to answer now. I just did. He almost smiled. Yes, you did. Annie gathered her folder. At the door, she stopped. Mr. Bennett? Yes? Justice can't depend on someone sitting beside the right stranger. Richard's expression became still. No, he said. It can't. Annie left the office with the 3-day trial schedule folded inside her folder. Richard remained by the window until the elevator carried her away. Then he crossed to his desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and removed an old black notebook he had not opened in years. 2 names were written on the first page. His was printed above the company's earliest design. The other had been crossed out. The shuttle left 5 Point Station at 5:45 the next morning. Annie sat near the back with her folder on her lap and watched downtown fade into warehouses, highway ramps, and rows of loading docks. Most of the passengers wore Westbridge badges. A few slept against the windows. Others drank coffee from travel mugs and spoke in low voices about overtime, equipment inspections, and supervisors who changed schedules without warning. Annie had packed a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. She had also brought the paperclip star, which rested inside her jacket pocket. When the shuttle stopped outside Distribution Center 7, the sky was beginning to lighten. The building stretched across several acres, its loading bays lined with trucks waiting beneath white security lights. Margaret stood near the entrance in a dark coat, holding a tablet. "You're early," she said. The shuttle arrived early. Margaret checked the screen. "Tyler is coming by car." Annie waited for her to add something about reliability. She did not. Daniel Price joined them and handed Annie a temporary badge. "For the next 3 days, you'll observe operations, review assigned data, and prepare recommendations. You may speak with employees, but do not interfere with active work." "Yes, sir. Ask before entering restricted areas." "I will." Margaret looked at Annie's folder. All notes remained company property. "My personal notes too?" "Anything based on internal operations," Daniel answered before Margaret could continue. "You may keep your own observations. You may not copy protected records or employee information." Annie nodded. "Understood." Inside, conveyor belts moved packages beneath fluorescent lights. Warning beeps came from forklifts reversing between marked lanes. Supervisors stood on a raised platform overlooking the floor. Tyler arrived 10 minutes later carrying coffee and wearing clean work boots that had never touched a warehouse floor. "Traffic," he said. Margaret glanced at her tablet. "You're here now." Annie said nothing. Daniel divided the candidates. Tyler would begin with the management team. Annie would follow the receiving process from truck arrival to inventory entry. A floor supervisor named Carl met her near the loading bays. "You ever worked in a place like this?" "No, sir." "Then stay inside the yellow lines." "Yes, sir." Carl appeared surprised by the answer. "You can call me Carl." Annie followed him toward the receiving area. She watched workers open trailers, scan pallets, and move goods toward storage lanes. The process looked efficient until she stopped looking at the motion and began looking at the waiting. One forklift operator sat idle while a scanner rebooted. 2 employees stood beside a pallet because the assigned storage lane was full. A truck waited outside an empty bay because the system still listed the previous trailer as active. Annie wrote down the times. A woman driving a forklift noticed her notes. Her badge read, "M. Harris." "You counting how slow we are?" she asked. "I'm counting how long the equipment makes you wait." The woman gave her a closer look. "That's not what people with clipboards usually count." "What do they count?" "How many boxes move after the waiting ends." Annie glanced toward the scanner in the woman's hand. "How often does it lose connection?" "Every morning around shift change." "Has anyone reported it?" "Every week for 6 months." "What happens?" "They send a message saying the issue has been resolved." The scanner flashed red. The woman held it up. "There, resolved again." Annie wrote down the time. "What should I call you?" she asked. "Marilyn." "I'm Annie." "You knew management?" "No, ma'am. I'm applying for a training program." Marilyn laughed once. "And they sent you down here before you got the job?" "It's part of the evaluation." "Then they're evaluating whether you know when to stay out of the way." "Probably." Marilyn pointed toward the raised offices. "Most people start up there." "I thought the problem might be down here." "The problem is usually up there. We just carry it around." Annie followed the direction of her finger. Near the next bay, an older man was entering information into 2 systems. He scanned each pallet, then typed the same number into a desktop terminal. "Why twice?" Annie asked Carl. "Separate tracking systems." "Do they connect?" "They're supposed to." "Do they?" Carl hesitated. "Not consistently." Annie looked at the staffing report Daniel had given her. The report showed the receiving team operating at 84% productivity. How does the system count the time spent entering the same information twice? As active work. What about waiting for the scanner? That's inactivity. So the company counts duplicate work as productive and equipment failure as employee delay. Carl studied her. "You've been here 20 minutes. Is that wrong?" "No." It's exactly what it does. At 7:15, a large truck arrived at Bay 4. The bay remained closed for inspection, but the scheduling system still directed the driver there. The truck waited. A supervisor told the driver to move to Bay 2, where another trailer was still unloading. The driver circled the building and returned 12 minutes later. Annie checked the performance dashboard. The delay appeared under driver noncompliance. She raised her hand toward Daniel, who was watching from the platform. He came down to meet her. This truck arrived on time, Annie said. Daniel checked the screen. The system says the driver missed the assigned bay. The assigned bay was closed. Daniel looked toward Bay 4. A maintenance sign hung across the entrance. Who entered the inspection schedule? He asked Carl. Facilities. 3 days ago. Why didn't dispatch update? Carl shrugged. Different system. Annie pointed to the dashboard. The report will blame the driver. Daniel read the status again. You found this during the interview exercise, he said. I found the same kind of mistake. This one is happening now. Margaret approached from behind them. What is happening now? She asked. Daniel explained. Margaret looked at Annie. Your task is observation, not real-time correction. If they don't correct it, the report will record the wrong cause. The operations team will review it later. When? Margaret's tone cooled. That is not your responsibility. Annie closed her notebook. Then whose is it? Carl looked away. Daniel said, I'll have dispatch correct the record. Margaret turned toward him. We should avoid changing live data during a candidate exercise. We're correcting an error, not changing a result. Annie watched Margaret's expression tighten. By mid-morning, Tyler had completed interviews with 3 managers and prepared a chart on employee accountability. Annie had spoken with receiving workers, drivers, a maintenance technician, and the clerk who handled shift records. The clerk showed her a staffing table. Several names appeared twice because the same employees were assigned to both receiving and scanning. Annie compared the list with the workers on the floor. The report counted 24 people. Only 17 were present. She brought the sheet to Daniel. 7 people are being counted twice. He checked the task codes. That would make the floor appear fully staffed. It isn't. Margaret entered the office as Annie spoke. You're drawing conclusions from a single shift, she said. I'm identifying a false count. The distinction may be more complicated than it appears. Annie placed the 2 lists side by side. 17 people are here. The report says 24. Which part is complicated? Daniel covered a smile with his hand. Margaret did not. Continue your assignment, she said. Annie returned to the floor. As she passed Marilyn, the scanner failed again. Marilyn lifted it toward her. Still resolved. Annie wrote down the second time. Then she noticed a red warning beside Marilyn's employee number on the dashboard. Low activity. The system had recorded every equipment failure as a choice Marilyn had made. Annie looked from the warning to the woman waiting for the scanner to restart. The numbers were not merely missing the truth. They were assigning blame. Annie waited until Marilyn's scanner restarted, then compared the red warning on the dashboard with the equipment log mounted beside the charging station. The connection had failed at 6:42 and again at 8:17. Marilyn's activity score had dropped during both periods, even though the device, not the employee, had stopped working. Does anyone correct these scores afterward? Annie asked. Marilyn returned the scanner to its holder. We report the outage. What happens after that is above my pay grade. Carl overheard them. The supervisor can submit a correction. Does the supervisor get an alert? Annie asked. No. Someone has to notice the score first, so if no one checks, the warning stays. Carl glanced toward the dashboard. Usually, Annie wrote the answer in her notebook. The company had created an automated penalty and a manual correction. The punishment happened immediately. Fairness depended on a busy supervisor finding time to request it. During the afternoon review, Daniel asked each candidate to summarize one concern. Tyler presented a chart showing that the receiving team needed clearer performance targets. Annie placed the equipment log beside Marilyn's activity report. The system records scanner failures as employee inactivity, she said. It lowers the worker's score automatically, but correcting the score requires a supervisor to notice the error and file a request. Margaret looked at the papers. That is an administrative issue, not a flaw in the performance model. It changes the model's result. Only in isolated cases. Annie opened her notebook. The scanner failed twice before lunch. The workers said it happens near every shift change. You spoke with several employees during one morning. That is not a complete sample. No, ma'am. That's why I'm asking for the outage records. Margaret folded her hands. Candidates are not authorized to request employee-level data. I don't need names. I need the times the equipment stopped working and the activity scores during those periods. Daniel nodded. That's a reasonable comparison. Margaret turned to him. The trial is intended to assess the candidates, not invite them to audit company systems. Richard was not at the distribution center. Without him in the room, Margaret no longer bothered to hide her impatience. Daniel looked at Annie. Submit the request through the trial portal. Ask for aggregated data only. I will. Annie entered the request before leaving for the day. She described the question, limited the dates, removed all names, and listed the operational reason for needing the information. When she returned the next morning, the request had been denied. The response contained one sentence, data outside candidate evaluation scope. She found Daniel near the operations office. Did you deny this? He read the message. No. Do you know who did? The approval route goes through human resources. Mrs. Whitmore? Her office. Annie showed him the dashboard. The residential risk column she had noticed during the interview exercise was no longer visible. Neither were the employee speech ratings that had appeared briefly on the first day. Were these columns removed because I asked about them? Daniel examined the screen. They may have changed the view. Can we see the previous version? He hesitated, then opened the internal document index. This list is available to trial participants. Don't open anything marked restricted. Annie searched the approved operational reports. Most had neutral titles. Equipment Utilization Review, Shift Coverage Summary, Regional Delivery Analysis. One file reference caught her attention. Riva, 8 metrów. What does Riva mean? She asked. Daniel leaned toward the screen. Racial Impact and Variance Assessment. There's no report with that title. There should be. He searched the reference number. A different name appeared. Regional Performance Variance Assessment. The file was marked available to the operations trial because it contained data related to staffing and retention. Annie looked at Daniel. Am I allowed to open it? The system says you are. She clicked. The first pages discussed hiring efficiency. The language was controlled, filled with percentages and technical terms. Annie read past the summary and found the section explaining which applicants were most likely to be removed before a final interview. Candidates from several lower-income zip codes received automatic stability penalties. Graduates of public high schools were more likely to receive low executive communication scores. Applicants with unpaid caregiving periods were classified as inactive, while applicants who took time away for travel or additional education were not penalized in the same way. Annie read the paragraph again. Her neighborhood appeared in the table. West End carried a moderate residential risk adjustment. A note beside the category explained that the area correlated with transportation inconsistency and employee turnover. The report did not ask whether an applicant arrived on time. It assumed the address could answer first. Daniel pulled a chair beside her. Keep going. The next section described voice analysis used in video interviews. The program measured word choice, pauses, sentence structure, and pronunciation. Applicants whose speech differed from the model's professional baseline received lower communication ratings. Who decided the baseline? Annie asked. Daniel did not answer. She found the recommendation section. The review team advised removing zip code scoring, suspending voice analysis, and separating caregiving gaps from unexplained unemployment. Below the recommendations was a management response. Implementation deferred pending client impact review. The approval line carried Margaret Whitmore's name. How long ago was this? Annie asked. 8 months. She knew. Daniel remained focused on the screen. The report shows her office received it and changed the title. That doesn't prove she ordered the change. Annie looked at him. Does a report rename itself? No. Then someone made it easier to ignore. She did not download the file or take photographs. Instead, she wrote the report number, date, section headings, and page references in her notebook. She copied the exact language of the recommendations and the management response. Daniel watched her. Why are you writing all of that? Because the screen can change again. He looked toward the hallway before lowering his voice. Be careful. About what? This company has lawyers whose entire job is deciding which truth can be called confidential. Annie closed the report. Does confidential mean false? No. Then it shouldn't be dangerous to ask why it was ignored. Daniel rubbed one hand over his jaw. You're still a candidate. That's why this matters. The report describes exactly what happened to me. He did not disagree. Annie returned to her assessment file and requested access to her personal scoring history. This time, the system approved the request automatically. Her score after the second video interview had placed her fourth among the finalists. At 7:31 that morning, someone added a residential stability penalty. At 7:34, her communication rating was reduced. At 7:38, her professional readiness score fell below the final round threshold. At 7:42, the cancellation order was sent to Human Resources. The changes had not come from the automated model alone. A user account had confirmed them manually. The account identifier began with the letters GHR, Global Human Resources. Annie wrote down the timestamp and account code. Daniel read over her shoulder. Can you identify the user? She asked. Not from this screen, but someone can. Yes. Will you help me find out who? Before Daniel answered, a notification appeared at the top of the screen. Session access under review. The report closed. Across the city, in her office on the 44th floor, Margaret received an alert informing her that Annie Carter had opened the renamed impact assessment and reviewed her applicant scoring history. Margaret read the notification twice. Then she closed her office door and called corporate security. Richard was halfway through a meeting when the alert reached his phone. A security review had been opened at Distribution Center 7. The subject line identified Annie Carter as the user under investigation. He read the message once, then again. The meeting continued around him. Two executives discussed the licensing contract, projected revenue, and the number of clients waiting to adopt Westbridge's hiring platform. Richard heard the words but stopped following their meaning. He opened the attached summary. Annie had accessed an operational report available through the trial portal. The report had been renamed 8 months earlier. She had also reviewed her own applicant scoring history, which the system had permitted. Nothing in the summary described stolen files, copied records, or restricted employee data. Yet Margaret had classified the matter as a possible confidentiality breach. Richard closed the message. I need 10 minutes, he said. The finance director stopped mid-sentence. We're due to vote on the pricing model. Then wait 10 minutes. He left the conference room before anyone could object. His office was empty. Morning light covered one side of the desk, but Richard did not sit. He opened the bottom drawer and removed the black notebook he had taken out the day before. The cover had softened with age. A strip of clear tape held the spine together. He placed it on the desk and opened the first page. 2 names appeared above the earliest Westbridge design. Richard Bennett, Samuel Brooks. Samuel's name had not been crossed out with ink. A line had been added in pencil years later. After the investors insisted that company materials present a single founder, Richard had told himself pencil could be erased. It never was. He turned several pages. Samuel's handwriting filled the margins. Questions about route prediction, staffing pressure, and the danger of using neighborhood data as a measure of employee reliability. One sentence had been underlined twice. Location may predict access. It does not measure character. Richard sat down. Westbridge's first investors had liked Samuel's work. They simply had not liked Samuel presenting it. At the first major pitch, one investor asked Richard to lead, while Samuel remained available for technical questions. Richard had objected after the meeting, quietly and in private. The investor told him clients needed to feel comfortable. Richard understood what the man meant. He also understood the company needed money. He accepted the arrangement for one meeting. Then another. Samuel's title changed from co-founder to chief systems engineer. His ownership percentage shrank during the next investment round. His name disappeared from presentation decks, even when the diagrams were his. Richard kept promising to correct it after the company became stable. Stability kept moving farther away. By the time Westbridge signed its first national contract, Samuel had stopped attending investor meetings. 6 months later, he left. Richard told reporters the separation came from a difference in vision. It was easier than admitting the vision had been shared and the recognition had not. He reached for his phone and searched for a number he had not called in 11 years. Samuel answered after the 5th ring. Richard. There was no surprise in his voice. Richard looked at the notebook. You still have my number? I have caller identification. I need to speak with you. You usually do when something has reached the point where speaking costs less than silence. Richard let the remark remain. A candidate found an internal report, he said. It shows our hiring system penalizes applicants based on zip code, public school education, caregiving history, and speech patterns. Samuel was quiet. The report recommended removing those variables, Richard continued. Margaret deferred the changes. And now you're calling me because? Some of the original safeguards are in your notes. They were also in the code. They're no longer there. I know. Richard sat straighter. How? Westbridge tried to recruit one of my engineers last year. He reviewed the public documentation before the interview. You knew the system had changed? I knew enough to stay away from it. Why didn't you contact me? Samuel gave a short laugh without humor. You built a global company. You have a legal department, compliance officers, auditors, and a board. Why would the person you pushed out be responsible for warning you about what you chose not to see? Richard closed his eyes for a moment. You're right. That sentence used to take you longer. I'm not asking you to excuse anything. Good. I'm asking you to review evidence. For whose benefit? A young applicant named Annie Carter. Samuel did not respond immediately. Richard explained the canceled interview, the coffee shop, the restored meeting, and the 3-day trial. He described Annie finding the false staffing count, the equipment failures recorded as employee inactivity, and the renamed impact report. When he finished, Samuel asked, "How old is she?" 18. And your company is already calling her a security risk. Margaret opened a review. You opened the door for her. Margaret is making sure she understands who controls the room. Richard looked at the security alert. She accessed only approved material. That may not matter if the goal is to punish the question. I can stop it. You could have stopped a lot of things. Richard accepted that too. Samuel continued. What do you want from me? I want you to confirm what the original model was designed to exclude. And then, I take it to the board, including my part in creating it? Yes, not as a consultant, not as an early employee, as co-creator. Samuel remained silent long enough for Richard to hear traffic through the line. And what will you say about why my name disappeared? Samuel asked. The truth. Which version? The one where investors preferred me in the room and I allowed that preference to become company policy. Richard looked at the pencil line across Samuel's name. I told myself I was protecting the business until I had enough power to correct it, he said. Then the business gave me power, and I used it to protect what we had built. What you had built? Richard looked down. What we built. Samuel's voice softened, but only slightly. Stopping what happens to Annie will not repair what happened to me. I know. It won't restore 11 years. I know. It won't make your public story true. No. Samuel let out a slow breath. Then don't call this redemption. I won't. What will you call it? Evidence. Samuel was quiet again. Finally, he said, send me the report through independent counsel, not your legal department. I want the version, history, model documentation, and approval trail. I'll arrange it. And Richard? Yes? If you bring this to the board, you tell them everything. You don't use Annie's case to remove Margaret while keeping your own history outside the room. I understand. No, you agree or you don't. Richard looked at the notebook, the erased credit, and the company skyline printed across the glass wall behind his desk. I agree. Samuel ended the call. Richard remained seated for several seconds before opening the security review again. Margaret had requested immediate removal of Annie's system access and authorization to escort her from the distribution center. Richard called Daniel. Daniel answered in a low voice. I was about to call you. Where is Annie? Still in the assessment office. Has security arrived? They're in the building. Do not let anyone take her notes. They are her own. Margaret says they contain confidential references. References are not company records. Daniel lowered his voice further. She's coming down here herself. Richard stood and reached for his coat. I'm on my way. The investor vote starts in 30 minutes. Delay it. They won't like that. Richard slipped Samuel's notebook into his case. For 11 years, I've been choosing what they like, he said. Today they can wait. He ended the call and headed for the elevator. 40 minutes away, Margaret Whitmore entered Distribution Center 7, with 2 security officers walking behind her. Margaret entered the assessment office without knocking. The two security officers stopped behind her, one on each side of the doorway. Annie closed her notebook. Daniel stepped between the desk and the door. "What is this?" "A security review," Margaret said. Miss Carter accessed material outside the purpose of her assignment. "The report appeared in the approved trial index," Annie replied. Margaret did not look at her. "Her access has been suspended. The trial is over." Daniel held up a hand. Nothing was downloaded. She reviewed an operations report and her own application history. "That determination will be made by security and legal." "I'm standing here," Annie said. "You can speak to me." Margaret turned then. Her expression remained controlled, but the courtesy from the interview room was gone. "You opened a confidential impact assessment, examined scoring records, and copied internal references into a personal notebook. I wrote down the report number and page references, which are company information. They're also evidence of how my score was changed." One of the officers shifted his weight. He looked uncomfortable, as if he had expected to collect a laptop, not remove an 18-year-old carrying paper and a borrowed pen. Margaret held out her hand. "Give me the notebook." Annie pressed it against her folder. "These are my notes. They were created during a company evaluation. They also include my interview answers, my work schedule, and the questions I prepared before I came here. We can separate the personal material later." "No." The word came out before Annie had time to consider how it would sound. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This is not a negotiation." Daniel moved closer. Richard gave clear instructions that her personal notes remain hers. "Richard is not here. He's on his way." Margaret glanced at the clock. "The investor session begins in less than 20 minutes. He will not leave it for this." Annie heard the certainty in her voice. Margaret was not guessing where Richard would be. She was counting on it. Daniel took out his phone. "I'll call him. You will do no such thing while a security review is active. You don't have the authority to stop me from calling the chairman. I have authority over this facility, this evaluation, and this candidate." Annie stood. The chair rolled backward and struck the wall. Margaret looked at the wrinkled folder in Annie's arms. "Miss Carter, your participation in the Operations Development Program is terminated. You are no longer a candidate for employment." The sentence was delivered with the same tone used to announce a meeting time. Annie felt the meaning arrive slowly. The interview Richard had restored was gone again. The 3-day trial was gone. The paid hours she had already begun counting toward rent were gone. "What policy did I violate?" she asked. "You accessed information beyond the reasonable scope of a candidate assignment. The system gave me permission. You knew the report concerned sensitive matters. I knew it concerned the work you asked me to evaluate. You were asked to analyze distribution operations. The report affected staffing and retention. You were not asked to investigate human resources." Annie held Margaret's gaze. "Maybe that's why nobody found the problem." Daniel stepped beside her. "Margaret, stop. We need counsel present before this goes any further." Margaret turned toward the officers. "Please escort Miss Carter to the lobby." Neither man moved immediately. The older officer cleared his throat. "Does she have company equipment?" "No," Daniel said. Margaret answered at the same time. "She may possess protected information." Annie opened the folder and removed the temporary badge. She placed it on the desk. "I have my resume, my interview notes, the exercise papers you gave me, and the notebook I brought from home. The exercise materials stay here," Margaret said. Annie removed the printed distribution reports and placed them beside the badge. She kept the pages she had written herself. Margaret pointed to the notebook. "That too." "No. You are making this more serious than it needs to be." "No, ma'am. I'm making sure you don't take the only record of what happened." Silence spread through the office. Workers beyond the glass partition had begun to notice. Marilyn stood near the scanner station. Carl had stopped beside a pallet. A supervisor whispered to another employee. Margaret saw them watching and raised her voice just enough to reach the floor. "This is precisely why established process should not be abandoned because of an emotional story." The words struck harder than the termination. Annie understood what Margaret was doing. She was not merely removing her. She was explaining Annie to the room before Annie could explain herself. A poor girl had impressed the chairman. The chairman had bent the rules. The girl had mistaken sympathy for authority and gone too far. That was the version Margaret wanted left behind. Annie turned toward the employees beyond the glass, then back to Margaret. "You didn't follow the process," she said. Margaret's face remained still. You changed my score after I passed, Annie continued. You hid a report under a different name. Then you called me a security risk for reading something your own system allowed me to open. Be careful. I have been careful since I walked into this company. Daniel said her name quietly, warning her that the officers were still there. Annie did not raise her voice. You kept changing the rules until the result matched what you decided about me before we met. Margaret stepped closer. Your access has been terminated. This conversation is finished. Annie slipped the notebook inside her folder. No, my part in it is finished because you have the power to make me leave. That is not the same thing. The older officer gestured toward the hallway. Miss Carter, we need to go. His voice carried no threat. Annie nodded once. She walked past Margaret without lowering her head. The trip through the distribution center felt longer than the morning shuttle ride. Employees moved aside as the officers escorted her between the marked lanes. No one spoke until she reached Maryland Station. Marilyn held the faulty scanner in one hand. So that's it? She asked. Annie slowed. Margaret, walking several feet behind, said, keep moving. Annie looked at Marilyn. Write down every time that scanner fails. Marilyn glanced at the officers, then at Margaret. Why? Because the system won't remember for you. The older officer allowed Annie another second before guiding her toward the exit. Rain had started outside. It struck the loading bays and darkened the pavement between the warehouse and the shuttle stop. There was no shuttle scheduled for another hour. Daniel followed her through the security doors. I'm sorry, he said. Annie turned. Did you know she could change my score? No. Did you know the report existed? I knew a review had been done. I didn't know what it found. But when I opened it, you understood what it was. He looked down. That's what I thought, Annie said. Daniel removed his glasses and wiped them, though they were not wet. I should have spoken sooner. Yes. He seemed surprised that she did not comfort him. Annie tightened her grip on the folder. Will you speak now? Before Daniel could answer, Margaret appeared inside the glass doors. She was waiting for him to return. His shoulders lowered. I need to understand what I can prove. Annie stepped beneath the narrow shelter by the curb. People like you always need one more document. That isn't fair. Neither is asking the person being removed to wait until your courage has enough paperwork. The security officers remained near the entrance but gave them space. Daniel put his glasses back on. Keep your notes safe. Is that advice or a warning? Both. A city bus stopped near the outer gate. It was not Annie's normal route, but it would take her close enough to a MARTA station. She stepped into the rain. At home, Denise was sitting at the kitchen table with an envelope open before her. The final rent notice lay beside 2 prescription bottles and a stack of grocery coupons. Annie stopped inside the doorway. How did it go? Denise asked. Annie placed the folder on the table. They ended the trial. Denise looked at the envelope, then back at her daughter. Why? Because I found something they didn't want me to see. She told her mother what happened without making herself sound braver than she had felt. When she finished, Denise reached across the table and covered Annie's hand. You wrote it down? Yes. Then don't throw those notes away. That night, Annie opened the notebook and recorded every detail while it was still clear. The report title, the original name, the page numbers, the account code, the time Margaret arrived, and every sentence spoken in the assessment office. She did not know whether anyone would believe her. She only knew that memory could be dismissed as emotion, while a record forced people to explain what it contained. The next morning, she returned to the Lantern Coffee House. Elena placed a glass of water on the corner table. Annie opened the wrinkled folder. This time, she was not preparing to answer their questions. She was preparing her own. Daniel arrived 20 minutes after Annie opened the folder. He paused inside the Lantern Coffee House, as if he had expected a public place to make the conversation easier. It did not. He removed his coat, thanked Elena when she brought coffee, and sat at the table Richard had used during Annie's interview practice. Annie did not close her notebook. You came, she said. I said I would. No, you said you needed to know what you could prove. Daniel placed a thin envelope on the table. Now I know. Annie looked at it but did not reach for it. What's inside? Nothing you should take home. Copies could create questions about how you received company records. Then why bring it? So I can show you before I submit everything through the board's audit committee. He opened the envelope and removed several printed pages. The first showed the history of Annie's applicant score. Her rating had been high enough for the final round until 4 changes appeared on the morning of her scheduled interview: a residential risk penalty, a lower communication score, a family stability flag, a final approval from an account connected to Global Human Resources. Daniel pointed to the user code. This account is assigned to Margaret's executive office. Can anyone else use it? Her chief analyst and one systems administrator have access, but the approval required her credentials. So she changed it. She authorized it. Annie read the timestamps: 7:31, 7:34, 7:38. The cancellation order was issued 4 minutes later. She didn't meet me until after 11. No. Annie looked up. Then what did she know about me? Daniel answered carefully. Your age, address, school, work history, recorded interview responses, and the information the system inferred from them. She knew enough to cancel me, but not enough to hear me. Daniel lowered his eyes. He showed her a second page. It contained an email Margaret had sent after Richard restored the interview. The chairman's intervention should not override established readiness controls. Proceed with evaluation, but document all concerns relating to maturity, attendance, exposure, and executive communication. Annie read the sentence twice. She decided what the concerns were before I entered the room. Yes. And you sat on the panel. Daniel did not defend himself. Yes. Did you see this email? Not until yesterday. But you heard her questions. I did. And you heard the questions she asked Tyler. Yes. Annie closed the envelope. Why didn't you say anything? Daniel held his coffee with both hands, though he had not taken a drink. I've worked at Westbridge for 16 years. My retirement is close enough that I can calculate it in paychecks. I have a mortgage. One of my daughters is finishing graduate school. I kept telling myself I needed stronger evidence before accusing the head of human resources of discrimination. And while you waited, people were rejected. Yes. He accepted the answer. I'm not asking you to excuse me, he said. Good. I'm asking you to let me correct what I can. Annie tapped the envelope. Does Richard know about this? He knows the review was opened and that Margaret approved the scoring changes. He does not have these copies yet. Why come to me first? Because you were the person removed from the building. I thought you should know what the records say before a room full of executives decides how to describe it. That answer mattered to Annie, not enough to erase his silence, but enough for her to listen. Elena approached with a small plate of toast. You two planning to order food? Or are you going to let my coffee do all the work? Daniel reached for his wallet. Elena pointed toward the counter. Pay when you leave. I don't like people waving cards while I'm carrying hot cups. After she walked away, Annie asked, Does the cafe have cameras? Daniel followed her attention toward the ceiling. Elena returned before either of them called her. Yes, she said. One above the register, one facing the front tables. Why? Annie explained what happened when Richard helped her practice and the call that canceled the interview. Elena folded her arms. You need Tuesday morning? Yes, ma'am. The system keeps 30 days. Would it show what we said? No sound. But it would show when he sat down, when the papers fell, and when you received the call. Daniel leaned forward. It could establish that Annie demonstrated her operational reasoning before she knew Mr. Bennett's identity. Elena looked at him. And who are you? Daniel Price, Senior Vice President of Operations. You were in the room when they questioned her? Yes. Did you speak up? Not soon enough. Elena held his gaze for several seconds, then nodded toward the counter. At least you've learned how to answer one question honestly. She agreed to preserve the recording and provide it directly to independent counsel. The bell above the door sounded. Richard entered carrying a black case. He had no driver or assistant with him. His coat was damp at the shoulders. Annie remained seated. You're late, she said. By 6 minutes. If I had been 6 minutes late to the interview, Margaret would have written it down. Richard took the empty chair. Then you should write it down. Annie did. He noticed but did not object. Samuel Brooks agreed to review the original model, Richard said. He will speak with independent counsel today. Daniel looked at the black case. Is that his notebook? Richard placed it on the table but kept his hand on the latch. Yes. Annie asked, Who is Samuel Brooks? Richard did not give the polished company version. He helped create the technology Westbridge was built on. Investors wanted me to be the public face. I told myself I would correct the imbalance after the company had enough power. Did you? No. What happened to him? His ownership was reduced. His title changed. His name disappeared from presentations. Eventually, he left. And you let the company call you the founder? Yes. Annie looked from Richard to Daniel. Two men with senior titles sat before her, each admitting that silence had protected something profitable. Why tell me now? Richard opened the case and removed the old notebook. Because Margaret's actions did not begin with Margaret. The company learned long ago that an unfair decision can survive if the people who disagree only do so privately. He opened the first page. Richard Bennett and Samuel Brooks were written above an early systems diagram. A pencil line crossed Samuel's name. Annie ran one finger near the edge of the page without touching it. You kept this? For 11 years. But you didn't fix the story. No. She looked at him. Then don't use what happened to me as a way to make yourself feel better. I won't. Don't stand in front of the board and act like Margaret damaged a fair company by herself. I won't. And don't ask Samuel to forgive you because you finally said his name. Richard's face tightened. I won't. Daniel watched the exchange without interrupting. Richard continued. The board is scheduled to vote tomorrow morning on a licensing contract for the hiring platform. If they approve it, this system could be used by hundreds of employers. Annie glanced at her notebook. This is bigger than my application. Yes. Does the board know? Not yet. Then why are we sitting here? Because when we enter that room, Margaret will say you misunderstood confidential data. She'll say Daniel violated policy. She'll say Samuel is angry about the past. She'll say I'm reacting emotionally because I met you in a coffee shop. Annie closed her folder. What do we have? Daniel listed the scoring history, approval records, emails, report references, and security review timeline. Elena confirmed she would preserve the video. Samuel could explain the original safeguards. Richard added, independent counsel will control the records. Margaret will not be able to claim we altered them. Annie thought of the notes Denise told her not to throw away. I want to present my own score, she said. Richard nodded. You should. I want to show the difference between the questions Tyler received and the ones I received. Daniel said, the interview transcript can confirm that. And I want Margaret to answer why my address counted before my work did. Richard closed Samuel's notebook. Tomorrow, she will. Annie shook her head. Not only her. Richard understood. He would have to answer too. Annie gathered the pages into order. What time is the meeting? 9 o'clock. I'll be there at 8:30. Richard stood. A car can pick you up. I'll take Marta. He did not argue. That evening, Annie prepared at the uneven kitchen table while Denise made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. She organized facts instead of interview phrases. She marked every claim that required a document and crossed out every sentence that asked for sympathy. Before going to bed, she placed Caleb's paperclip star inside the folder. The next morning, she buttoned the same borrowed blouse and carried the same worn pages toward Westbridge. This time, she was not going there to ask for a job. She was going to make people with power explain what they had done. Annie arrived at Westbridge at 8:24. Security checked her name twice before issuing a visitor badge. The guard who had directed her to Richard's office during the interview avoided her eyes. Claire met her near the elevators. The board is already gathering. Is Margaret here? She arrived before 7. Of course she did. Claire almost smiled, then led Annie to a conference room on the 43rd floor. Daniel sat near the window with independent counsel, a woman named Rebecca Shaw. Elena was there in a blue coat, holding a flash drive that contained the Café recording. Richard stood at the far end of the room with Samuel Brooks. Samuel was in his late 50s, with a close gray beard and a leather folder beneath one arm. He did not resemble the younger man in the company photograph Richard had shown Annie the night before, but she recognized the restraint in his posture. He stood as though he had entered a place that once knew his work but not his name. Richard made the introduction. Mr. Brooks, Annie said, thank you for coming. Samuel shook her hand. You're the reason they finally opened the records. I only found the report. You kept reading after they expected you to stop. Rebecca checked the time. We need to agree on the order. Mr. Bennett will pause the licensing vote and disclose the internal review. Mr. Price will present the operational findings. Miss Carter will address her application and the interview process. Mr. Brooks will explain the original system safeguards. And Margaret? Annie asked. She has the right to respond. Richard looked at her. The board may try to move into a private legal session before you finish. Can they? Yes. Will you let them? No. At 9, the doors opened. 12 board members sat around the main table. Several had laptops open to the licensing proposal. Margaret occupied a seat near the company's general counsel. She wore the same controlled expression she had used during Annie's interview. Her eyes moved toward Samuel, then stopped. Richard remained standing. Before we vote, he said, I am suspending discussion of the hiring platform contract. A board member near the center frowned. We have clients waiting for approval. They will continue waiting. Margaret turned toward him. Richard, this matter has not completed internal review. That is one reason it will not be sold. He placed Samuel's black notebook on the table. This system contains scoring practices that may discriminate against applicants based on address, education, caregiving history, and speech. An internal assessment identified those risks 8 months ago. The recommendations were not implemented. The room changed at once. Screens lowered. Chairs shifted. The general counsel began writing. Margaret spoke calmly. The assessment identified statistical variance, not discrimination. No final conclusion was reached. Richard looked at Rebecca. Show the management response. A page appeared on the main screen. Implementation deferred pending client impact review. Margaret's name appeared beneath it. She did not look at the screen. The review was deferred because removing variables without replacement controls could reduce accuracy, she said. Daniel opened the distribution center records. Accuracy for whom? He presented the false staffing counts, the closed loading bay listed as active, and the scanner failures recorded as employee inactivity. The platform repeatedly assigns responsibility to workers for delays caused by equipment and scheduling. He said, it also applies higher root risk scores to several black neighborhoods despite lower recorded delays. One board member leaned toward the screen. Are these live records? Yes. Why did operations not identify this earlier? Daniel did not shift the blame. Because I trusted summary reports more than the people working under them. Margaret turned to the board. These examples concern operational configuration. They do not prove bias in applicant selection. Rebecca changed the display to Annie's scoring history. Annie saw her name appear above a series of timestamps. Her hands grew cold, but she kept them on the folder. Richard nodded toward her. She stood. My score placed me 4th after the second video interview, she said. On the morning of my final interview, the system added penalties tied to my address, communication, and family stability. A global human resources account approved those changes. 4 minutes later, my interview was canceled. Margaret looked directly at her. The account confirmed an automated recommendation. It did not create one. Annie faced her. Why was my address used to decide whether I was reliable? Residential data can help predict transportation and retention risks. I arrived early every day. The system evaluates groups, not individual exceptions. I am not an exception to my own life. No one interrupted. Annie continued. During my interview, you asked whether public transportation made me unreliable. Tyler arrived 12 minutes late because a private car used the wrong entrance. You excused him before he sat down. Margaret folded her hands. Different circumstances require different questions. You asked him what kind of leader he wanted to become. You asked whether I could handle adult responsibility. Mr. Grant had completed college, and I had reduced inventory loss by $800 a week. That experience was considered. It was categorized as entry-level retail before anyone read the report. Margaret turned toward the board. This is an emotional interpretation of a structured process. Elena spoke from the second row. She was solving business problems before she knew who Richard was. Rebecca submitted the Café recording. The screen showed Annie at the corner table, rehearsing alone. Richard sat beside her. The pages fell. He helped gather them, then listened while she wrote on the napkin. There is no sound, Margaret said. No, Elena replied. But the timestamp proves she spoke with him before Human Resources canceled the interview and before he identified himself. Richard opened the black notebook. The quality of her answers is not the only issue, he said. This company has a history of deciding whose work appears credible based on who presents it. He turned toward Samuel. Several board members looked confused. 2 looked away. Richard placed the first page beneath the document camera. His name and Samuel's appeared above the original Westbridge design. The pencil line crossing Samuel's name filled the screen. Samuel Brooks co-created the system that became the foundation of this company, Richard said. Investors preferred me as the public face. I accepted that arrangement. His title was reduced, his ownership was diluted, and his name disappeared from our history. Margaret's composure slipped. That dispute has no connection to the current hiring model. Samuel stood. It has every connection. He opened his folder. The original model prohibited the use of neighborhood data as a measure of personal reliability. It separated access from character. It also rejected accent scoring because professional communication cannot be reduced to similarity with the speech of the people who designed the test. He placed the original technical standards beside the current documentation. Those safeguards were removed. A board member asked, "By whom?" Rebecca displayed the version history. The changes had been approved through human resources and product leadership during the previous 2 years. Margaret's authorization appeared on 3 releases. Margaret looked at Richard. "You approved the commercial expansion." "I did." "You received every quarterly report." "I did." "And now you are presenting yourself as surprised?" "No." Richard's answer silenced the room. "I am presenting myself as responsible." Margaret pushed back her chair. "This hearing is being driven by a rejected candidate, a former employee with a grievance, and executives attempting to protect themselves from a chairman who ignored governance." Annie looked at her. "You keep calling everyone's evidence an emotion." Margaret turned. "You accessed confidential material. Your system gave me access. You knew it was not intended for you. I knew it described what your company did to me." Margaret's voice sharpened. "You were a candidate in a 3-day trial, not an investigator." Annie removed the paperclip star from her folder and placed it beside her notes. "No. I was the result your system hoped nobody would question." The general counsel whispered to the board chair. He called for a private session. Richard remained standing. "Miss Carter finishes first." Annie faced the table. "I am not asking you to hire me because this happened. I am asking whether Westbridge plans to keep selling a system that treats a zip code as character, an accent as intelligence, and caregiving as instability." No one answered. She looked from one board member to the next. "You asked the system to find risk. It learned which people this company was already comfortable doubting." The board chair removed his glasses. Margaret reached for her tablet. But Rebecca spoke before she could touch it. "Do not access company systems." 2 independent security officers entered through the side door. Margaret looked at Richard. "You cannot remove me because an applicant embarrassed the board." Richard closed Samuel's notebook. "No," he said. "You are being placed on leave because the records show you concealed a discrimination warning, approved biased scoring changes, and retaliated against the person who found them." The officers approached her chair. For the first time, Margaret had no red pen, no private office, and no system ready to speak before the person in front of her. The board had not reached its final decision, but the licensing vote was dead, and the room could no longer claim it had not seen the truth. The board remained in private session for nearly 3 hours. Annie waited in a smaller conference room with Denise, Elena, Daniel, and Samuel. Richard stayed with the directors. Denise sat beside her daughter, still wearing the plain navy uniform from the hotel laundry. She had come directly from work after Annie called from the lobby. "You ate breakfast?" Denise asked. "Yes." "What did you eat?" "A granola bar." "That is not breakfast." Annie almost laughed. "I just spoke in front of 12 board members, and that's what you want to discuss? I can't make 12 board members act right. I can make sure you eat." Elena pushed a wrapped sandwich across the table. "Your mother has a point." Annie unwrapped it but took only 1 bite. Her body had not stopped reacting to the meeting. Every time the hallway door opened, she expected someone to say the evidence was insufficient or the company needed more time. Samuel sat near the window, reading the copy of the original system standards. His name appeared on the first page without a line through it. Daniel checked his phone, then set it face down. "Have you heard anything?" Annie asked. "No." "You've checked 6 times." 7. Elena looked at him. "You count better when the numbers concern you." Daniel accepted the remark. "That's fair." At 1:18, Rebecca Shaw entered. Everyone stood. "The board has taken several actions," she said. "Margaret Whitmore has been removed from all duties pending an external investigation. Her system credentials are disabled, and the company has issued a preservation order covering emails, model changes, evaluation records, and security requests. Annie held the sandwich without moving. Rebecca continued. The licensing contract is suspended. Westbridge will notify every client currently testing the platform that the results may contain discriminatory factors. May? Annie asked. That is the legal language approved for immediate notice. What language would you use? Rebecca met her eyes. The system produced decisions influenced by factors that should never have been treated as evidence of individual ability. Annie nodded. That's clearer. It is, Daniel asked. What about applicants who were rejected? The board authorized an independent review covering the last 3 years. Applicants affected by the disputed variables will be contacted and offered reassessment. 3 years? Samuel said. The version history shows the first unsafe release was approved earlier. Rebecca opened her notes. Independent counsel has authority to expand the period if the records support it. Samuel leaned back. They support it. Then the review will expand. Annie placed the sandwich on its wrapper. What happens to my application? Rebecca's tone softened. The cancellation has been voided. Your original ranking is restored. That only puts me back where I was before someone changed it. Yes. And the trial. The board wants to restart the final evaluation under independent supervision. Annie looked toward Daniel. Same candidates? Every eligible finalist will be invited, Rebecca said. Same assignment, same information, same time, and scoring criteria provided in advance. Will Tyler be there? If he accepts. Denise touched Annie's arm. You don't have to go back into that building. I know. Richard entered before Annie could answer. His tie was loose, and the black case was under his arm. The board also accepted my resignation as chief executive chair, he said. Daniel stood. Effective when? Immediately for operational authority. I will remain on the board without executive control until the investigation finishes. Then the directors will vote on whether I remain at all. Annie studied him. Was that their decision or yours? Both. Samuel closed the technical standards. And the company history? Richard set the black case on the table. The board approved a correction to the corporate record. You will be publicly identified as co-founder and co-creator of the original platform. An independent firm will calculate the ownership and compensation you lost. Samuel's expression did not change. A calculation is not an agreement. No, your attorneys will review it. And the public statement? You will approve every sentence that concerns your work. Samuel nodded once. It was not forgiveness, but Richard did not treat it as such. Richard turned to Annie. There is one more matter. The board wants to offer you a place in the operations development program. Annie's face tightened. Without the new evaluation? Yes. No. Denise looked at her but remained silent. Richard did not appear surprised. May I ask why? Because tomorrow someone will say I received it for accusing the company. Next month another person will say I received it because you met me in a coffee shop. I won't spend every day proving I did not take someone else's place. The board believes your work already meets the standard. Which standard? The one Margaret used? The one the system changed? Or the one you're writing now because the company is embarrassed? Richard had no immediate answer. Annie continued. I'll return for the reassessment if the same rules apply to everyone. I want my results recorded without your name beside them. You have that right. I should have had it the first time. Yes. The reassessment took place 5 days later at a rented training center outside Westbridge property. Independent evaluators removed names, photographs, schools, addresses, and personal details from the written work. Each candidate received the same distribution problem and access to the same records. Tyler came. Before the exercise began, he approached Annie near the water station. I didn't know what the system was doing, he said. I know. I keep thinking about that interview. So do I. They made it easier for me. Yes. He looked down at his identification number. I thought easier meant I was better prepared. Annie did not rescue him from the discomfort. What do you think now? I think I was never asked to prove as much. That doesn't mean you have nothing to prove. He nodded. I know. The assignment concerned a regional warehouse losing contracts because of repeated delivery failures. Most candidates recommended more staff, stricter supervision, or new software. Annie found that the warehouse had enough workers and functioning equipment. The delays began after a scheduling policy moved high-volume clients ahead of smaller customers without adjusting loading capacity. Drivers for smaller routes waited until overtime began, then received poor efficiency scores for leaving late. She proposed a rotating dock schedule, separate delay codes, and a weekly review that included drivers and floor employees instead of managers alone. 2 days later, Rebecca called Annie and Denise to the Lantern Coffee House. Elena brought coffee for Denise and water for Annie. Rebecca placed an envelope on the table. You ranked first. Annie did not open it immediately. Who scored the work? 3 outside operations experts. They did not receive names until after submitting their results. And Tyler? Third. Annie opened the envelope. Inside was the program offer, salary, start date, benefits, and a written explanation of her score. Operational reasoning, exceptional. Evidence use, exceptional. Communication, clear and direct. Leadership judgment, strong. She read the last line twice. Denise leaned closer. Well? Annie handed her the letter. Her mother covered her mouth with one hand. Richard sat at the next table, though no one had invited him into the conversation. He had returned to the same chair where he first heard Annie rehearsing answers she did not believe. She looked over at him. This time she said, I earned the offer before anyone knew my name. Richard nodded. Yes. Annie signed the acceptance letter. Then she looked at Rebecca. My first assignment should be the review team. You haven't started the program yet. The company hasn't finished correcting the people it rejected. Rebecca smiled slightly. I'll take that as your first recommendation. It isn't a recommendation. Richard lifted his cold coffee. No, he said. It rarely is. 1 year later, Annie entered the Lantern Coffee House at 8:10 on a Tuesday morning and ordered coffee instead of water. Elena placed the cup on the counter. You still don't like coffee. I'm learning. You've been learning for a year. Annie added milk until the drink turned pale. Some systems take longer to correct. Elena looked toward the corner table. Speaking of systems, a young woman sat there with a laptop, a stack of index cards, and a folder held together with tape. She wore a gray jacket that was too large at the shoulders. Every few seconds, she whispered an answer, stopped, then deleted a line from the screen. Annie recognized the pattern. Interview? She asked Elena. Westbridge. Annie looked again. How do you know? She has said the company name 12 times. Was she loud? No. I listen. Annie carried her coffee toward the corner table but stopped one chair away. Are you practicing for an interview? The young woman looked up. I'm sorry. Was I talking too loudly? Annie almost laughed. No. You weren't loud. The answer settled between them with a meaning only Annie understood. The woman closed the laptop halfway. My interview is at 10. I'm applying for an operations analyst position. What question are you working on? Why should we hire you? And what's your answer? The woman glanced at the screen. I'm hardworking, dependable, and eager to contribute. Annie sat at the next table. Those 3 things could be written on anyone's resume. The woman frowned. That's what my career coach told me to say. Your career coach isn't being interviewed. Annie nodded toward the folder. What have you done that no one asked you to do? The woman studied her with the same caution Annie had once given Richard. Do you work in human resources? No. Are you a recruiter? No. Then why are you asking? Because you're trying to sound qualified instead of explaining why you are. The woman opened the laptop again. I work nights at a medical supply warehouse, she said. The company kept losing small orders because they were placed behind hospital shipments. What did you do? I created a separate shelf for orders under 5 pounds and grouped them by pickup time. Did it help? Missed pickups dropped by almost half. Then start there. The woman deleted the prepared sentence. Annie drank the coffee and immediately regretted ordering it. What's your name? She asked. Jasmine Reed. I'm Annie. Jasmine's eyes moved toward the Westbridge badge clipped inside Annie's coat. Annie Carter? Yes. You're on the review committee. Not anymore. I read about you. Annie shifted in her chair. Then you read a summary. They said you exposed the hiring system. I asked questions. Other people opened the records. They changed the whole program because of you, not because of me alone. Westbridge's review had expanded from 3 years to 7. More than 11,000 applications had been reassessed. Hundreds of candidates received new interviews. Others received written notices explaining that their earlier scores had relied on factors the company no longer considered valid. The company removed zip code penalties, accent comparisons, caregiving flags, and school prestige adjustments. Every automated rejection now required a named employee to approve it and explain the reason in writing. Applicants could request their score history without hiring a lawyer or knowing the chairman. The changes cost Westbridge clients, money, and several senior executives. Annie considered that part necessary. Jasmine leaned forward. Is the new system fair? Fairer. That isn't the same thing. No. Then how do you know this interview is worth attending? You don't. But now you can ask how they scored you. Who reviewed the result? And what evidence supports it? Jasmine looked at her notes. Do people ask those questions in interviews? They should. At 9, Annie left the cafe and walked to Westbridge headquarters. She still used MARTA, though her salary allowed other choices. The route remained predictable enough when she planned for delays, and she refused to let the company describe that decision as a weakness. The lobby had changed. A display near the entrance listed the founders of Westbridge Global: Richard Bennett, Samuel Brooks. Beneath Samuel's name was a statement explaining his role in creating the original logistics system and the decisions that erased his credit. Samuel had approved the wording after rejecting 4 earlier versions. He now served as an independent technical advisor to the board. He did not return as an employee. Richard remained a director without executive control. His office moved from the 44th floor to a smaller room on 21. The company had offered him the old office twice. He refused both times. Annie found him standing near the display. You're early, he said. By 6 minutes. I wrote it down. He held up a small notebook. Annie glanced at the display. Samuel approved the final plaque? Last night. Did he like it? He said it was accurate. That isn't what I asked. No, it isn't. Richard looked at the 2 names. He said liking it would take longer. That sounds reasonable. They entered the elevator together. Annie pressed 44. Richard pressed 21. You're presenting the annual hiring report? He asked. Yes. Nervous? No. He raised an eyebrow. A little, she admitted. What's your greatest weakness? Cold coffee. That answer has improved. The doors opened on 21. Richard stepped out, then turned. How did the cafe interview go? She hasn't had it yet. You helped her prepare? I asked one question. Did her papers fall? No. Then the story is improving. The doors closed before Annie could answer. On the 44th floor, the board gathered around the same table where Margaret had questioned her transportation, maturity, and address. The chair in front of the panel had been removed. Candidates and employees now sat at the same table as the people evaluating them. Daniel waited near the screen. His retirement had been postponed by his own choice. He spent part of each week visiting distribution centers without advance notice, speaking with employees before reviewing dashboards. You have the final numbers? He asked. Annie handed him the report. Every figure verified twice. By the system? By people? He smiled. The meeting began. Annie presented the results without turning them into a celebration. The company had improved interview access and reduced unexplained rejection gaps. It had also failed to correct every affected applicant, and several managers still used informal standards that produced unequal results. A board member asked, "Would you describe the reform as successful?" I would describe it as active. That sounds cautious. It should. Fairness is not a policy you announce once. It's a result you keep checking. Samuel, attending by video, nodded from the screen. After the meeting, Annie returned to the Lantern Coffee House. Jasmine sat at the corner table with her folder open and a Westbridge visitor badge beside her coffee. How did it go? Annie asked. They offered me a second interview. Because you met me? No, the panel didn't know we spoke. Good. Jasmine smiled. I told them about the small order shelf. And? They asked for the records. Do you have them? Every week for 6 months. Annie took the chair at the next table. Elena brought 2 glasses of water without asking. Jasmine touched the edge of her folder. Do you think they'll hire me? I don't know. That's not very encouraging. It's honest. Jasmine considered that, then nodded. Outside, office workers moved along the sidewalk while buses stopped at the corner. No one in the cafe knew which person would lead a company, change a warehouse, or uncover a decision hidden inside a report. That was the point. Opportunity could not depend on being recognized by a billionaire at the next table. Justice could not depend on a powerful person feeling responsible at the right moment. A fair system had to work when no chairman was listening, no camera was recording, and no public embarrassment forced people to act. Annie lifted her glass. "Practice the next question," she said. Jasmine opened her notes. This time, when she answered, she used her own words. The story teaches us that talent should never be judged by a person's race, address, accent, education, or social background. Real justice begins when people question unfair systems, record the truth, and speak even when silence feels safer. Opportunity should not depend on meeting the right powerful person. It should come from fair standards that allow every individual to be seen for their work, character, and ability. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.